Last week, China unveiled the nation's second domestically developed stealth fighter, known officially as the J-35. This new twin-engine aircraft comes in both runway and carrier-capable variants, and is meant to not only bolster China's rapidly expanding fleets of larger J-20 stealth fighters, but to do something no other nation has managed to do before: to end America's global monopoly on exporting stealth aircraft. These new stealth fighters could give China a massive boost in power projection capabilities in the Pacific, as they were designed to operate off of the nation's forthcoming catapult-equipped Class 003 supercarriers, dramatically complicating the combat calculus for American planners focused on deterring Chinese aggression in the South China Sea and beyond. But before the J-35 can shift the balance of power in the Pacific, it'll have to prove that it can do more than just look the part of an advanced stealth fighter. In a world full of copycat designs, high-profile vaporware, and autocratic regimes making big claims about systems that rarely live up to the hype, could the J-35 really have what it takes to bring America's air dominance into question? Or is it just another designer imposter? Let's see if we can't figure it out. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. If you're anything like me, the only thing you'd like more than getting your hands on a piece of aviation history is to help bring that history to life for a new generation. So let's talk about how you can do both with today's sponsor, the Mark 1A Spitfire watch from Rec Watches. Now, this isn't just any old watch, it's crafted from genuine aluminum that was pulled from the legendary Spitfire Mark 1A X4009, which flew in the Battle of Britain with ace fighter pilot Patterson Clarence Hughes at the stick. Each watch not only celebrates this incredible legacy, but it helps to fund the ongoing restoration of that X4009 aircraft. And when I say each watch is a piece of history, I mean it. Every one has unique marks and patina, so no two watches are alike, giving you a genuinely one-of-a-kind timepiece. These Swiss-made watches come with bold Arabic numbers, strong lume, and a design inspired by World War II pilot watches. So you can not only wear history, but you can look the part too. Now, I'm not kidding when I say I want one of these watches. In fact, I intend to order one myself, and the X4009 watches are exclusively available from RecWatches.com, and they're currently on pre-order with a 25% discount with shipments available in December. But fans of this channel can tack another 10% discount on top of that by following the link in the description below and using the code SAND, S-A-N-D, at checkout. Again, that's RecWatches.com and the discount code SAND. Visit Rec Watches today and wear some history on your wrist. In late 2002, the Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force announced its intentions to develop and field a new stealth fighter in a similar vein to America's class-leading F-22 Raptor, which, at the time, was still working its way towards service. This effort, initially dubbed simply JX and later changed to JXX, ultimately resulted in a contract award to the Chengdu Aerospace Corporation for their Project 718 design in 2008. And that contract would ultimately result in China's operational J-20 today. But despite failing to secure a formal nod from the PRC, another of those competing firms, the Shenyang Aircraft Corporation, decided to press on with their stealth fighter design using internal funds, with the intended goal of competing with the new American-led F-35 program as the world's only other stealth fighter on the export market. Now, this effort would continue under several different designations in the Chinese press, including the F-60, the J-31, and the J-21, and was finally officially dubbed the FC-31 by Shenyang in November of 2012, using the common Chinese export fighter prefix of FC. Now, according to Shenyang, the aircraft made its first flight at around the same time, but details made available about this first flight remain pretty sparse. Now, 2 years later, and almost exactly a decade ago this month, the FC-31 made its public flying debut at an air show in China, powered by a pair of Russian-sourced RD-93 turbofan engines, very similar to the ones that powered the Soviet-era MiG-29. And its performance left a lot to be desired. As aviation journalist Reuben Johnson reported at the time, China's new stealth fighter appeared sluggish and incapable, with the pilot seemingly struggling to keep its nose up during hard turns and being forced to lean into the afterburners more often than other similar fighters would need to in order to maintain a maneuvering energy state. And as Johnson rightly pointed out in his coverage at the time, this poor performance came when the aircraft was not carrying anything close to the weight it would be in combat, including a full suite of avionics and a payload bay full of air-to-air missiles. The program was largely quiet again after that for another 2 years, and then in December of 2016, Shenyang's second FC-31 prototype took to the sky for the first time, sporting several big improvements over its predecessor, led by a pair of new Chinese-sourced WS-13E turbofan engines in place of the dated Russian RD-93s that had powered the first prototype. Now, these new engines were really just upgraded copies of those RD-93s, but they did offer a small but respectable boost in power output to the tune of roughly 13% more thrust without the afterburner and around 16% more thrust with the afterburner engaged. While these smokeless turbofans did improve maintenance requirements and likely had at least some beneficial impact on stealth, they remain engines designed and intended for fourth generation or non-stealth fighter applications. Now, the rest of the aircraft also saw similar iterative improvements, with slight changes made to almost every surface and structure, from the cockpit canopy all the way back to the vertical tail surfaces, all aimed at improving the fighter's stealth and aerobatic capabilities. Now, this design overhaul took place between 2014 and 2016, and it closely aligns with a similar and pretty complete overhaul of China's premier stealth fighter, the Chengdu J-20, which also saw significant improvements and revisions between its second prototype in 2012 and its third that emerged in 2014. And that timeline is notable because in August of 2014, a Chinese national named Su Bin was indicted for the theft of over 630,000 protected documents relating to various American military aircraft programs, including the F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II, dating as far back as 2008. This spy, named Su Bin, gained access to defense contractor systems and coordinated with PLA hackers to not only execute the theft, but to prepare full reports for Chinese officials. And he did not mince words about this effort, even bragging to his Chinese contacts that the information they stole about the F-22 and F-35 programs specifically would, quote, allow us to rapidly catch up with US levels to stand easily on the giant's shoulders. Of course, it is important to understand that having access to documentation and even blueprints for America's stealth fighters doesn't necessarily mean you can build a copy of one. Aircraft like the F-35 represent the collaboration of countless firms tasked with designing and mass-producing a very long list of separate systems that ultimately need to work seamlessly together. An aircraft like the F-35 is not one invention produced by Lockheed Martin, for instance, but rather an array of inventions produced by experts in countless different fields integrated into a single functional form. So, while China was obviously able to expedite development by drawing pretty direct, let's call it inspiration, from Lockheed Martin's stealth fighter designs, especially when it comes to the overall radar-deflecting planeform, the similarities between Chinese and American fighters remains largely skin-deep. Now, it wasn't until 2020 that the Chinese government finally came around to funding this new stealth fighter. And while the PLA only formally acknowledged that there was a new fighter in the works, Chinese media rightfully assumed that this new fighter would be a variant of the FC-31. one that was meant specifically for carrier duty, likely aboard China's newest Type 003 supercarrier, which would rely on new electromagnetic catapults to launch aircraft rather than the ramp found on older Chinese carriers. This new iteration of the fighter would fly for the first time just about 1 year later, in October of 2021, boasting heavier-duty landing gear that included 2 wheels at the nose rather than 1, and a catapult launch bar to support launches from that Chinese carrier. It also came with a sensor turret on the chin for a new electro-optical targeting system, and in true carrier form, this new J-35, as it was dubbed, also came with folding wings. Some slight changes to the fuselage design likely allowed for a bit more onboard fuel storage, and all things considered, this new prototype was certainly quite a bit heavier than previous test articles, which likely offset any performance gains made from the transition from the Russian to the Chinese-sourced WS-13 engines. Now, that may have gotten a little bit better the following year, when yet another prototype surfaced, this one sporting upgraded WS-13X engines, sometimes called WS-21s. Now, these new Chinese engines are still based on that same dated RD-93 design, but they offer serrated exhaust nozzles and other changes meant to offset some degree of both radar and infrared detectability. And finally, a land-based variant of the fighter, now known as the J-35A, made its first test flights in September of last year, carrying lighter landing gear and slightly smaller wings. And this Runway Queen variant, the J-35A, is the version of the fighter that was revealed this past week. Alright, so now that we're all clear on the timeline, let's get down to brass tacks and talk about how this fighter really stacks up as compared to American stealth jets like the F-35. Now, despite their conspicuously similar appearances, China's J-35 is actually meant to serve in a very different role than America's F-35. Now, modern fighters are all expected to be truly multi-role in their capabilities, carrying all the requisite systems on board to competently prosecute both airborne and ground-based targets. But despite this inherently broad skill set, fighter programs still tend to prioritize either the air-to-air mission, commonly called air superiority, or the air-to-ground mission, commonly called attack operations. America's F-35, for instance, may be a very capable air-to-air platform thanks to its extreme degrees of both low observability and sensor fusion. But the jet's design prioritizes the air-to-ground, or attack mission set, leaving the air superiority mission to its sister fighter, the F-22 Raptor. According to Chinese media outlets, the J-35 and J-35A are not following suit and are instead focused first on the air superiority mission. And as such, the J-35 falls into a role that just doesn't really exist right now within the US inventory as the low end of a 5th generation air superiority high-low mix. China's in-service stealth fighter, the Chengdu J-20, was arguably designed to serve as a long-range interceptor capable of engaging American fighters thanks to a high degree of frontal aspect stealth, or stealth from head-on. At nearly 70 feet long and boasting roughly 26,000 pounds of internal fuel capacity, the J-20 has an impressive claimed combat radius of some 1,200 miles. In other words, it can fly as far out as 1,200 miles before it needs to turn around to head back. Now, the much smaller J-35, at only around 56 feet 9 inches long, is a much shorter-ranged fighter with a claimed combat radius of only around 750 miles. Now, this shorter range is, one could argue, a much bigger drawback for the J-35 than it is for America's F-22 or F-35, both of which offer similar fuel ranges. You see, China's tanker fleet is primarily made up of some 24 dated H-6 refuelers and a handful of Ukrainian-sourced IL-78s, with their new YY-20, which is roughly comparable to America's long-serving KC-135 in terms of fuel delivery capabilities, now making its way towards service. The US, on the other hand, operates more than 568 specialized refueling aircraft, not to mention maintaining the capability to refuel from non-specialized platforms like other fighters. Put simply, when it comes to airborne refueling, there is no country in the world that comes even close to matching America's tanker fleet. But the ability to launch these new J-35s from China's forthcoming Type 003 aircraft carriers, and maybe even from their ramped carriers eventually as well, could certainly offset some of this range anxiety, because it would give China the means to scramble stealth fighters from, well, really anywhere in the Pacific that's within a few days' travel of a friendly port. The J-35 also departs dramatically from the F-35 when it comes to propulsion, using that aforementioned pair of WS-13 turbofans in place of the single Pratt & Whitney F-135 that powers America's carrier-based stealth jets. Now, some have argued that the J-35's use of two engines makes it more suitable for carrier operations from a safety and survivability standpoint, because it allows for the possibility of a single engine failure without the aircraft going down. And indeed, this really was pervasive wisdom within the US Navy for a long time. But this thinking went out of style as turbofan reliability continued to climb, and today, single-engine aircraft have such low engine mishap rates that they almost always outperform their twin-engine predecessors in terms of safety. And that means in this power class, there's really very little benefit to using two engines rather than one, unless you have concerns about engine reliability. Now, China's aforementioned WS-13X engines produce a claimed 12,760 pounds of thrust without their afterburners each, and 21,000 pounds of thrust under full afterburner, for a combined 25,520 pounds of thrust without the afterburner engaged and roughly 42,000 pounds with the afterburner at full tilt. Which means this new twin-engine fighter not only produces less power than America's twin-engine Super Hornet, but it produces less power than America's single-engine F-35 as well. Of course, like the J-20, China ultimately envisions flying the J-35 with advanced new turbofan engines that have yet to manifest. The J-20 just started testing with its intended engine, the WS-15, late last year, and the J-35's intended power plants, the new WS-19s, are said to be based directly on technologies being matured in that WS-15 program. Maximum power output for these new WS-19s varies depending on your source, with some claiming 22,000 pounds of thrust under afterburner for a combined 44,000 pounds of thrust, just barely beating out the F-35's 43,000. Others claim as high as 26,000 pounds of thrust, which would give this aircraft a monstrous 52,000 pounds of thrust under afterburner. But at this point, these claims are all pretty hypothetical. The WS-15 is still a few years away from being fielded in numbers in the J-20, and it seems likely that the WS-19 is even further out for the J-35. But honestly, much more pressing than the amount of power produced by these engines are the technologies brought to bear within them. Pratt & Whitney's F-135 builds off of its immense success with the powerful F-119s they designed for the F-22 Raptor, resulting in extremely powerful engines that outperform previous turbofan designs in terms of weight, power production, reliability, fuel efficiency, heat dissipation, electrical power production, and more. China's ongoing struggle to field the WS-15 engine for their J-20, like the J-35 flying with WS-13X engines on board, all point to the fact that China is still struggling to catch up to the propulsion technologies the US began fielding more than a quarter century ago in 1997. And the US at least intends to extend this technological lead with the next generation adaptive propulsion program that's already underway and is fielding engines like GE's Adaptive Cycle XA100, which offers double-digit improvements in fuel efficiency, loiter time, and power production over even the advanced F-119 and F-135 engines found in today's American stealth fighters. Now, despite being slightly larger than the F-35, the J-35 is expected to be a little bit lighter, with a maximum takeoff weight of around 62,000 pounds, roughly 4,000 pounds less than an F-35A. Now, this, combined with a sleeker design, China claims, will allow the J-35 to reach a maximum speed of Mach 1.8, a bit faster than the F-35's Mach 1.6, but it isn't clear if that Mach 1.8 claim is with the engines the aircraft currently flies with or with the engines it's intended to fly with, someday. The J-35 is also designed to carry 4 medium-range air-to-air missiles internally, like China's PL-15, which matches the F-35's ability to carry 4 AMRAAMs internally, at least until the Block 4 upgrade increases that limit to 6. The F-35 also maintains a dominant lead in terms of onboard avionics. The J-35 is expected to carry China's latest KLJ-7A active electronically scanned array radar, which is an improvement over the older KLJ-5 believed to be housed in the nose of the J-20. Now, this KLJ-7A has already seen service in the Block 3 JF-17 and is broadly considered to be competent for both air-to-air and air-to-ground operations. But this is another place where America has a multi-decade spanning lead in developing and fielding this sort of technology, and the F-35 currently carries the most technologically advanced and powerful radar array ever affixed to a fighter in the AN/APG-81, and even that system is due for a replacement in the forthcoming Block 4 upgrade to the new AN/APG-85. And as such, by the time the J-35 enters service, it will be carrying a radar array that is at least 1, but likely 2 or even 3 generations behind the arrays found in F-35s. And in a similar story, the J-35 appears to carry the same EOTS-86 electro-optical targeting system that's already found in the J-20. And this is also a competent system, but one that falls similarly short of the F-35's AN/AAQ-40 system that works in conjunction with the aircraft's distributed aperture system. And while these generational technological differences manifest in lots of ways throughout the targeting process, maybe one of the easiest ones to point to is the fact that the J-35 and J-20 are limited to using their electro-optical targeting systems for targets that are ahead of the aircraft, whereas the F-35 can identify and engage targets in literally any direction. And it's almost certain to be the same story throughout all the rest of the avionics you'll find inside the J-35, because despite emerging years after the F-35, this aircraft still reflects China's ongoing effort to close the technological gap with Western powers like the US. And while China has made huge progress in this regard, there remains a great deal of ground to cover. But none of this means the J-35 can be dismissed outright. In fact, this fighter could be a big problem for the United States and its allies in the long run. So let's talk about what the J-35 actually means for American defense. You see, the J-35, like the J-20 that came before it, may not be as stealthy or as technologically advanced as their American counterparts, but the realities of air combat mean they don't need to be. Ultimately, the level of technology you bring to bear is only one of many variables that inform the outcome of a fight. And as history has proven time and time again, a high level of training, insightful and effective combat strategy, overwhelming production capacity, and even good old-fashioned luck can all play a role in offsetting or even overcoming a technological disadvantage. As I've said lots of times on this channel before, we need to stop thinking of airborne engagements in terms of who would win between one F-22 and one J-35, and instead start thinking of them in terms of who would win between hundreds of different combat aircraft, all operating in concert with one another to bring different capabilities to bear in order to achieve competing objectives. And yeah, I realize that's not very concise, but effective analysis really rarely is. The truth is, how the J-35 would fare in a fight with an American F-35 is just less important than how it could enable China's military to advance their strategic objectives over the Pacific through an increase in low observable air power that can scramble from well beyond Chinese shores. Engagements with other fifth-generation fighters, like the F-35, are entirely possible and even likely, but so are engagements against less capable fourth-generation platforms like the F-A-18 Super Hornet or the F-16 Fighting Falcon. Engagements where the J-35 would have a distinct advantage. But most pressing of all could be the J-35's likely inclusion in China's rapidly maturing long-range detection and targeting apparatus, using the aircraft's onboard sensors as yet another node in a broader kill chain, meant to guide long-range anti-ship weapons like the hypersonic DF-ZF into encroaching American aircraft carriers. If the J-35 is sufficiently low observable, it could play a huge role in locating and relaying target coordinates that could ultimately bring down an aircraft carrier, all without it ever firing a shot. And in a more broad geopolitical sense, the J-35 also represents what could very well be the end of yet another American stealth monopoly, this time on exporting fifth-generation fighters. While Russia's export-oriented Su-75 checkmate may have ultimately proven to be little more than a plywood mock-up and vaporware, the J-35 already has a solid decade's worth of testing behind it and is being fielded by a nation that has a demonstrated ability to build low observable airframes in volume. The advanced avionics making their way into its fuselage likewise benefit from testing and maturation in other platforms already, making for an aircraft that's likely to perform at a high level compared to other Chinese fighters very rapidly. And while China may be known for its theft of technologies, and it is tough to ignore the Lockheed Martin design elements shining through the J-35's approach to stealth, it is equally important to recognize and acknowledge the rapid progress China has made in several areas that are vital to advanced aircraft design. China has not only invested in the production infrastructure required to build these jets, but in the academic infrastructure needed to continue producing scientists and engineers who can push technological boundaries even further. Where China was once a nation with such limited design capabilities that it was forced to steal designs or purchase entire production lines from the Soviet Union in order to field its own fighters, it has now eclipsed Russia as a global leader in aviation, and will soon join the United States as the only other nation on Earth with more than one stealth aircraft in service. In a future fight over the Pacific, the J-35's smaller size and lower production costs could allow for fielding these fighters in greater numbers than the J-20, increasing the number of stealth threats American military planners have to contend with, and on a long enough timeline, China's J-35 exports could likewise grant it more geopolitical influence over nations hoping to place orders of their own. But despite the broad and significant implications of the J-35 entering production and then eventually service, I also want to remind you that these are all only possibilities. The J-35 is not in service yet, and in fact, it'll probably take years to get there. It hasn't demonstrated game-changing aerobatic or stealth performance, hasn't proven to come with a low cost of production, hasn't started operating off of deployed aircraft carriers, hasn't relayed target data to surface-based weapon systems. It isn't known to be adorned in advanced radar-absorbent materials, and the engines meant to power this jet don't really exist yet. Despite being in development for more than a decade already, this is still a very new fighter program, and new programs don't always go smoothly. So what is the real story with the J-35? Well, it's not as capable or as advanced as the F-35. It's not as air-to-air dominant as the F-22, and it's not as mature as the J-20. But it is a sign of the Chinese military's rapid progress in the field of aviation technology and its continued commitment to closing the gap between Chinese and American air power. But for now, that's all it is. A sign. A symbol of where Chinese aviation is headed. And 10 years from now could be a whole different story. So you better believe I'll be keeping my eye on it. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.